Bright lights. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you. And welcome, everyone. It is so fabulous to look out and see this full auditorium and a very lively auditorium. And thank you to everybody tuning in online as well. My name is Melissa Ho. I am curator of 20th century art at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's program, which we are presenting in conjunction with the exhibition Pictures of Belonging, Miki Hayakawa, Hisako Hibi, and Miné Okubo. This show was curated by ShiPu Wang for the Japanese American National Museum and is on view here at SAAM through August 17th. Pictures of Belonging brings into the spotlight three 20th century painters that many museum visitors and even many American art scholars have not encountered before. Hayakawa, Hibi, and Okubo are not household names, but all three of these women led significant and sustained artistic careers, and their voices today continue to connect profoundly with viewers. Tonight we wanted to talk about how a show like this comes to be, and more generally about strategies and models for expanding knowledge about the histories of artists of Asian descent in the US, artists who have too often fallen to the historical margins. 20th century Asian American artists have long been underrepresented in museum collections and displays, art historical scholarship, and the art market. But there is increasing interest and activity in all of those spaces around the work and legacy of these artists today. Our three speakers tonight all bring deep experience in researching historical Asian American artists and their communities, and for years have worked toward the preservation and public understanding of their work. They come from different backgrounds and have worked in different realms, in academia, in culturally specific organizations, in museums, in publishing, and independently. Each of our guests will make a short presentation to introduce themselves, followed by a group conversation that will include the opportunity for some questions from the audience. So if you have a question, we ask that you write it down on the back of a comment card, and if you need a comment card, please just raise your hand and one of the program attendants will bring it to you. There are full bios of the speakers in your program, so I will keep my introductions brief. First, we'll hear from ShiPu Wang, who is the Coates Family Chair in the Arts and Professor of Art History at the University of California, Merced. ShiPu is the author of numerous books and journal articles, and in addition to Pictures of Belonging, he curated the touring exhibition Churo Obata, an American Modern, which was presented here at SAAM in 2019. Our next speaker will be Patricia Wakida, a fourth-generation Japanese-American artist, writer, and community historian. In addition to her practice as a linoleum block and letterpress printer, Patricia has for decades done editorial, curatorial, and research work that illuminates the stories of Japanese-American artists and writers. And finally, David Martin, who is curator for Cascadia Art Museum in Edmonds, Washington. David is a leading authority on the art history of the Pacific Northwest, and for over 30 years has centered his research on women, Asian American, and gay and lesbian artists of the early and mid 20th century of that region. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, ShiPu Wang.
Lights are really bright. I wish I could see you all, but thank you, Melissa, and all the teams at SAAM for organizing this event and hosting Pictures of Belonging. You have done a tremendous job, and it's really gratifying to see all the positive responses toward the exhibition and the public programs. Thanks, too, for including me in today's event, something that I had been anticipating with excitement and dread since we talked about this back in February 2024. This is partly because I naturally prefer to stay out of the spotlight. That's why I work in archives. I like working in archives. And be on this stage as well, the opposite of that. But it also feels like I have put most of what I had to say about Pictures of Belonging into my January virtual presentation. Hopefully, when today's program is up on YouTube, that video will pop up right around here. Look at me imitating YouTubers. But I do know that today's conversations will be different from the academic presentations we've come to expect in this auditorium. Our remarks and discussions will be more based on practical, on-the-ground experiences that inform our work, such as Pictures of Belonging and those that Patricia and David will share. And because Melissa encouraged us to take a more personal tone, I get to share a few things in my background and approach that may help explain why I've pursued these recuperative and interventionist curating and research projects. Before I proceed, I do need to acknowledge the Isabel Coates Endowment that has funded my Coates Family Chair in the Arts at the University of California, Merced, since 2018. Such funding is so critical because conducting original research, which requires travel and lodging for an extended period of time and repeat visits, is simply costly. So I've had the privilege of accomplishing many projects thanks to the endowment. Oh, that's my title page. What you are seeing on the screen are views of my childhood home in Taiwan. It's still there, and some of these are recent photos. Growing up, I didn't think much about the paintings and frames that were on the walls and took up various spots in our house. My parents both painted all the time and displayed their works at home and in regional shows and self-curated exhibitions in local art centers. They also managed to sell some of their artworks, my father much more than my mother, and while those sales were modest in amount, I understood, even as a child, that having their paintings acquired by someone offered a tangible form of affirmation and encouragement. For my father in particular, it was important and meaningful to earn recognition for his watercolors through participating in juried or invited shows and taking on leadership roles in regional artists associations. As I mentioned in my January talk and the exhibition catalog's acknowledgments, in my youthful self-centeredness, it didn't occur to me that my mother, whose interests and talents were quite diverse, did wish for comparable recognition for her oil paintings. Until, that is, she made some wistful comments when her health began to decline on her unfulfilled potential and staying in the background as a wife and mother as the society expected women to do. Her eventual death in June 2021 brought into sharper focus the question of what we should do with her decades of paintings. At least for me and my older brother, who's here in the audience with my sister-in-law, by the way, not from Taiwan, from Illinois. My thought has always been that people who like or love my mother's paintings should be able to display them in their homes, which is infinitely better than stacking them in the corners of the house. If we really wanted to sell paintings, I would want the profits to go towards supporting local charities. My father agrees in principle, but isn't completely on board. His trepidation is understandable because he has established a reputation and has followed a conventional value scale, such as pricing a painting based on size. The idea of giving away paintings was a difficult proposal to wrap his head around, I think. These considerations relate to some of the questions I've dealt with in curating and working with artist estates in the US. Among them are, what does it mean to preserve an artist's legacy, especially artists whose works have not been collected by museums, are not in the so-called canon, and do not have commercial representation? How does one decide what the desirable or even quote-unquote best outcome is after an artist has passed away? And what are the estate executors' personal and ethical responsibilities for taking care of these works? These, to me and other family members of artists, are not abstract questions. They are as real as the artworks that take up physical space, require care, and demand a varying amount of physical, mental, and emotional energy, often over a long period of time. These are also real questions I kept in mind when curating both the Chura Obata retrospective and Pictures of Belonging. A shared feature of both exhibitions is that the majority of the works came from private collections and artist estates, with some from museums. Here, I do want to recognize, again, as I did in my January lecture, institutions like the Japanese American National Museum, the organizer of Pictures of Belonging, and the Riverside Community College District's Center for Social Justice and Civil Liberties, among others, for their decades-long commitment to safekeeping the works of artists who historically did not receive mainstream art museums' attention. Without them, and without curators and collectors who cared about these artists' works, such as the late Karen Higa, the late Michael Brown, and the major collector of Asian American art, Mr. Richard Sakai, to name only a few, some of the artworks that we display today likely would not have survived. The same recognition goes to the artists' families, of course, many of whom have held and cared for the largest numbers of artworks by the single artist for decades. These include the Obatas and the Kodanis, Ibuki Hibi Lee, the daughter of artists Hisako and Matsusaburo Hibi, and now her next generations since she passed away in January this year, and Seiko Buckingham, trustee of the Miné Okubo Charitable Corporation. Some of them are actually here with us today. As the scholar and curator, I needed to figure out ways to earn the family's trust and gain access to their collections. It's actually quite invasive if we are being honest about it. For the kind of recuperative research I do, with the aim to reconstruct a fuller picture of an artist's entire career, I'm asking the families to open up their life and private living quarters, to allow me to rummage through their treasures, and ask endless and very personal questions, and in the process, touch on sensitive topics that sometimes even the family members have not discussed among themselves. It was also my responsibility to show them that I'm barging into their life for the quote-unquote right reasons. Now, what is considered right in this context varies quite a bit, and I think you will hear us discuss more about what those ethical and professional considerations, approaches, and boundaries are in our discussion. But for me, some of the guiding reasons and objectives are to see and learn about an artist's full body of work as much as possible, not just the few well-known or easily accessible pieces. Having a more comprehensive understanding of an artist's full career allows me to make informed selections of works to study and include in an exhibition. And with a fuller grasp of what artworks are still available, I'm then able to help connect and match the artist's estates with the right institutions for collecting and acquisition purposes. I'll come back to this last point in a little bit. But first, I want to offer a couple of examples to illustrate the practical ways through which I work with the artist's families. The Chura Obata retrospective I curated had about 160 objects on display. To get to that number, I saw and studied almost 800 pieces of his artwork in various collections. With the majority of Obata's work at the estate, I made contact with the family to access their collections way back in 2010. The retrospective opened nearly 8 years later, by the way, which tells you a little bit about how long an exhibition can take to realize. Along with Miya Kodani, one of Obata's granddaughters, who is also in the audience tonight, we spent 4 days in the spring of 2011, I'm a historian, going through folios of works on paper. I offered to photograph every piece we examined and measured, and by the end of that week, I was able to compile an illustrative inventory of more than 450 works to share with the family. It became a helpful database for many purposes. As the retrospective was touring, I thought, are the artworks returning to the family? What if some of them, such as this magnificent screen, does not need to go back to the shoe closet where it was stored, but to a major American art collection? Safe, but still a shoe closet. I approached the family about possibly offering it to a museum, as I know they had a history of gifting Obata's artworks to institutions, and they gave me the go-ahead with the matchmaking. It wasn't just any museum I had in mind, but the Smithsonian American Art Museum, the final venue for the International Obata Tour. SAAM responded positively, discussions ensued, and the acquisitions of several works were finalized after the retrospective finished its tour in 2020. Of course, the process was much more involved and protracted than what I'm describing now, but essentially that established the format with which I facilitated the placement of artworks and artist papers from the estates into art museums and archives for the past 7 years. And just for reference, since the conclusion of the Obata tour in early 2020, shut down by COVID, more than 300 pieces of his artwork have entered collections of American art throughout the nation, many for the first time in the institution's history. It has been an eye-opening learning experience for me, and the nuance of working with so many curators and museums is also fascinating. I'm happy to say more during our discussion. But the experience did inform my approach when I was curating Pictures of Belonging, as I kept an eye out from the start for identifying potential homes for the artworks that I was bringing out of the estates and private collections. This was because I realized that, sure, curating and touring an exhibition has its generative benefits, but getting artworks into museums' permanent collections accomplishes additional goals. I also had the privilege of learning about this and seeing this firsthand when I served on the National Portrait Gallery's Board of Commissioners for 4 years. Acquisitions enable museums to tell stories, generate experiences and discussions through displaying and integrating into their narratives those artists who have not been recognized by our institutions. Their artworks encourage critical conversations about collecting history and practice, institutional blind spots and biases, and productive ways to represent more complete and accurate versions of American art history. And indeed, with Pictures of Belonging, these artists' artworks are entering major American art collections for the first time. For instance, Melissa and I collaborated on getting the Hibis and Okubo's paintings into SAAM's collection even before the exhibition tour began. My Terra Foundation Fellowship at the Brooklyn Museum in 2022 enabled me to help them acquire Obata's and Hibi's paintings among other artists' works, and for the first time, Hibi and Obata are represented in the museum's recently reinstalled American art galleries. Currently, I'm also co-curating a touring exhibition with Dr. Shannon Victoria at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, or LACMA, and we are having such a great time finding dozens of obscure historical artworks by American artists of Asian descent that could be acquired by LACMA for the first time. Once again, none of this is possible without the participation of the artists' estates and some private collectors. Because they have had such a range of experience in caring for artworks and interacting with museums, I've had to remind myself to be flexible in my approach, be patient against my natural inclination, and refrain from being pushy. At least I hope I've done a good job, although I know I can be quite, let's just say, persistent in nudging people. One thing I don't have to remind myself to do, though, because it's almost innate to me, is to stay sensitive and understanding toward individual family members' divergent needs and family dynamics. This is where my being a son of two painters comes in handy, I think, as I work with the artist estates with empathy, open-mindedness, and a long-term commitment. It's fair to say that these are also key characteristics in the approach toward the kind of work that all three of us speaking today do. And now you will get to learn more from Patricia Wakida. So please help me welcome Patricia to the stage.
Thank you so much, ShiPu. Good evening, everyone, and thank you again to Melissa Ho and the Smithsonian American Art Museum for inviting me to participate in this panel discussion. So, allow me to indulge myself by sharing some personal background. I am a fourth-generation Japanese American, or a Yonsei, with roots in California's Central Valley. I'm an oral historian and a writer specializing in Japanese American stories. mother and father were young children, aged 4 and 5 when they were exiled with their parents in 2 of the 10 World War II American concentration camps in Gila River, Arizona, and Jerome, Arkansas. In 1942, 125,000 Japanese Americans were forced into these prison camps after President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the military to incarcerate anyone living on the Pacific coast that they deemed a threat to national security. As a Yonsei, I only had a sliver of time with my immigrant ancestors. That was back in the 1970s, and that meant I learned most of what I know about my Issei and Nisei family through researching papers and photos in various archives across the country. When I say that my work is to awaken archives, it means that my writing and art is rooted in historical research and oral histories. Well, what are archives? Archives are living tools for education and truth-telling. They are mementos and documents that tell a story. They help us to remember the past and become evidence for future generations seeking an understanding of our world today. It's important to note that archives are not neutral spaces. Archivists have the ability to save or erase an individual's history, or even the history of an entire people. What is recorded, what is saved, what is protected, these are all decisions that are made about who is remembered. How would you feel if your entire cultural identity was erased? Or if the story of your family's history existed, but anything that told that history specifically just wasn't preserved? Throughout my career, I relied heavily on oral histories and primary documents such as old newspapers, letters, birth certificates, immigration logs, and census records to create a picture of who a long-lost artist or writer was. For example, in 2011, I was invited by historian and editor Brian Nia to join the Densho Encyclopedia team to build a free, publicly accessible online educational resource that focuses on key concepts, people, events, and resources on the World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans. I'm still writing for the Densho Encyclopedia and have completed dozens of entries utilizing these research tactics combined with active work in the JA community, Japanese American community. For today's purpose, though, I want to share a story about one artist's archives, the circumstances that protected his papers and artifacts for decades, his family who saw the value in this, and finally, the project that I was personally involved in that helped bring his story and artwork to the larger public. In 1992, a major donation of art and artifacts belonging to the late immigrant artist Henry Sugimoto was made to the Japanese American National Museum, or JANM, by his daughter Madeline Sugimoto and sister-in-law Naomi Tagawa. It consisted of 142 oil paintings and boxes of sketchbooks, diaries, woodblock prints, letters, photos, newspaper clippings, and other ephemera. A common experience for Japanese Americans is that their families have very little to nothing that exists before pre-war. The hysteria leading up to the mass incarceration, during the hysteria leading up to the mass incarceration, thousands of families either burned things out of fear or discarded them as they moved from place to place like vagrants until after the war. Sugimoto was a rare exception. His wife's family, the Tagawas, owned a beloved hand laundry in their hometown of Hanford, California, a tiny rural town in California's Central Valley, and when they were forced out, they were able to warehouse everything in the laundry for the duration of the war, preserving it in time. While reports of racial violence against Japanese Americans were slightly higher in rural areas, it was also a less desirable place to live, and many farmhouses and homes that were boarded up went undisturbed for many years. What also made the Sugimoto donation so special was that his daughter and Sugimoto himself made such an effort to ensure that the stories behind the objects didn't disappear with time. When the Sugimotos moved to New York after the war, he remained in the same apartment until he died, another lucky circumstance that allowed him again to retain his art and belongings. The next point I want to make is about the people and the institutions who advocate for Japanese American artists. When JANM opened in 1992, it premiered a major exhibit titled View from Within, which featured 135 works of fine art created by incarcerees and was curated by the brilliant, tenacious, and charismatic art historian named Karen Higa. To research artwork for the exhibit, Karen traveled around the country, occasionally accompanied by JANM's first curator of history, Jim Hirabayashi, tracking down Japanese Americans who had produced artwork in camp and building relationships. I attended View from Within when it traveled to San Jose, California. It was my first time experiencing fine art created in the concentration camps and meeting Karen. And to my astonishment, Karen later came to my alma mater, Mills College, in 1994 as a guest lecturer. Fellow Mills student and friend Christine Kim studied under Karen, and when she graduated, she continued on to JANM as Karen's protege. While Chrissy went on to JANM, I ended up in publishing. I was 28 years old when I was hired by Heyday Books, based in Berkeley, California. A year after I was hired, the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program, or CCLPEP fund, was established through the California State Library. This competitive grant fund program funds projects that educate the public about the wartime incarceration. And Heyday applied for funding that first year and was approached by numerous people with manuscripts related to the JA experience, thus beginning an entire series at the publishing house. This included Only What We Could Carry, the Japanese American internment experience, which I served as lead researcher and co-editor with poet Lawson Fusawi Nada, a Toshio Mori literary reader, and the now classic Topaz Moon, Chiyoda Obata's Art of Internment. Soon after the publication of Topaz Moon in 2000, JANM approached Heyday to collaborate on a series of artist catalogs, which I served again as the project director for, overseeing the writing and editing and the manuscripts and production, as well as marketing and research. So those three books were Henry Sugimoto, Painting an American Experience, published in 2001, Living in Color, The Art of Hideo Date in 2002, The Peaceful Painter, Memoirs of an Issei woman artist, which is Hisako Hibi, in 2004. And the funding of CCLPEP was an essential component in producing all three of these catalogs. Like Okubo, Hayakawa, and Hibi in Pictures of Belonging, Sugimoto actively had painted before, during, and after the war. Although he had a promising beginning to his career, exhibiting widely through California and even Europe in the 20s and 30s, he had become almost unknown in the ensuing years after the war. The redress and reparations movement, which resulted in a presidential apology and reparations of $20,000 to each survivor from the camps, led to a major resurgence and rediscovering Japanese American art and literature. Sugimoto, like Miné Okubo, had meticulously documented his experience from the moment he first heard about the attack on Pearl Harbor to harrowing day-to-day details of life behind barbed wire. The discovery of Sugimoto's vast output led to some of his paintings being included in early exhibits of artwork produced in the camps, including the Smithsonian Museum of American Histories, A More Perfect Union in 1987. One of the things I really admire about Sugimoto was that he immediately recognized what his role was in this terrible mass imprisonment and had the talent to illustrate his journey to the camps. He had the presence of mind to bring a few tubes of pigment, 3 brushes, and a small bottle of turpentine among his worldly possessions. He also taught art school in Jerome, Arkansas, the camp that he was imprisoned at. Among the items that were discovered in the donations to JANM were a series of composition books that Sugimoto had cut in half, doubling the number of sketchbooks that he could bring, which allowed him to record what he saw from the train window from the Fresno Assembly Center to their arrival at the permanent concentration camp in Arkansas. Chrissy and Karen also discovered Sugimoto's memoir, which he had begun writing at age 78. It included his motivations, feelings, and beliefs regarding art, family, and the world, and it gave us all a sense of who Henry Sugimoto was as an artist in person. I have to credit Dr. Emily Anderson, who was tasked with translating the memoir from Japanese to English midway through the book's production, since it wasn't discovered until months after the collection had arrived and things were still being unpacked. We all unanimously agree that both of those items should be included in the catalog, along with Christine Kim's essay on Sugimoto's life. The exhibit, the book catalog, and a short documentary film were simultaneously released in 2001 and traveled extensively in US and to Japan. The success of a solo exhibit of this relatively unknown 20th century Japanese American artist encouraged other institutions to acquire Sugimoto's work. Subsequently, Madeline Sugimoto donated an additional 240 oil paintings and more than 200 watercolors in 2015, making it the largest single collection at JANM. Under my urging, Heyday would publish many, many more books on the Japanese American camp experience, including the accompanying catalogs on Date and Hibi, as I mentioned, and it continues to publish important memoirs, biographies, and other historical books on incarceration today. Among the people in this photo is Ibuki Hibi Lee, daughter of painters Matsusaburo, George Hibi, and Hisako Hibi, who would eventually make a major donation of their mother's work to JANM. Throughout this project, Karen would always remind me that books have a lifespan that can outlive an exhibit. It is a compact package and can be shared easily, and its publication often leads to interviews and excerpts from the text to be discovered decades later, with high-quality reproductions of the art true to the original colors. Now more than ever, we must protect our shared memory. This history serves as a reminder of the consequences of injustice, but also of the strength and resilience of those who endured. History is shaped by what we choose to remember. Awakening archives usually entails just creating a historical inventory of people and events in a chronological order. But occasionally, when I'm left alone with the photos, the interviews, the pages of handwritten correspondences, and I have the time to really sense the story embedded in those records, I can actually hear music. I can hear the poetry of a person's soul. Thank you. Our next speaker is David Martin, curator at the Cascadia Museum in Edmonds, Washington, and I'm pleased to invite David up to the stage.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I really can't see anything out there. Greetings from the other Washington, the soggy one. I wanted to mention that my involvement with reviving the reputations of Asian American artists in the Pacific Northwest started 39 years ago next month. And having been born and raised in Niagara Falls, New York, when I moved out west, I had never heard of the incarceration camps before. And when my partner and I moved to Phoenix in 1981, we were there for 5 years. And during that time period, I had learned and apprenticed with an art conservator for paintings and some works on paper. And so when we moved to Seattle in 1986, I was really the only conservator there. There was no one practicing that at all in Seattle at the time. And within a month of me moving there, or us moving there, I met a man named George Nomura. And George brought in a painting to where I was working, and you can see this painting in the lower left. It's called Gymnasium. That painting was in really rough condition when I first saw it in 1986, and I didn't know what it was. I asked who the artist was because it was really, I thought, a very fine painting, and he said it was his father and that painted it. And I said, "Was your father in the military?" And he said, "No, that was camp." And I had no idea what he was talking about. So after I did learn what camp was, and after I restored this painting, he invited me to come to his house and see the other works that were in storage, mostly in his garage. And so they were in pretty rough condition. So as I was getting to know Mr. and Mrs. Nomura, I started seeing these incarceration paintings. That's what you see, the two there on your right. They were incarcerated at Minidoka in Idaho. And George Nomura had lived there, unfortunately, with his parents, was sent there as well. ShiPu had mentioned about condition. Some of these paintings that I restored for them were in really rough condition. And the self-portrait from 1925 that you see on the screen, his granddaughter just found it after the death of George and his wife. And that painting was in extremely bad condition, and it was rolled up inside of a closet in the home. It had been there for over 50 years. So as I started learning about these artists, when I first got to Seattle, I was told that there wasn't much activity in the early part of the 20th century by any artists at all. and that it was, things didn't happen until after World War II. And there were four Caucasian men that were sort of the definition of what they called the Northwest School or the Northwest Mystics. And they were profiled in the 1953, in the September 1953 issue of Life magazine. And even up until the 80s, that was still what people thought, that these were the only successful artists. And the really strange thing about that was that the artists were copying or being heavily inspired, I should say, by Asian art, Asian artists, and Native American artists. However, the artists themselves who were Asian American and Native American were sort of overlooked. So I thought I would start looking into what actually happened in this region, who actually were the artists who formed this aesthetic in the Northwest. And for those of you who are younger, can you just imagine doing this research without the aid of the internet? It was really dismal. It was very, very difficult. But once I started meeting family members, they had actually kept archival materials that also related to other artists. And so my first artist that I was really interested in was an immigrant named Yasushi Tanaka. And Tanaka was considered the earliest, well, no one knew who he was when they first started researching him, but it turned out that he was the first abstract artist in Washington State. He and a friend named Imogen Cunningham, who was a very well-known photographer, they were friends with a man named Robert C. Torrey of San Francisco. And after the Armory Show in 1913, Marcel Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, #2, which you see there on the screen, came to Seattle. And this was something that was not known, and it came because of Mr. Tanaka and Imogen Cunningham's friendship with Frederick Torrey. So I started using this as my guideline for if he's the first and earliest abstract artist, what happened next. So you can see to your right, there's the center piece was, it's a self-portrait from 1915. And the piece on the right is also from 1915. It's one of the a Cubist work. Now, the Duchamp, people had mixed feelings about it, of course. It went from being a brilliant futurist, Cubist work that was introduced into the United States to being derided as an explosion in a shingle factory by a nasty critic. So Mr. Tanaka's story is that he was in Seattle until 1920, and then, like so many artists of that period, moved to Paris. And he settled in the studio of poet Ezra Pound and remained there for the rest of his life. And he died before the war in 1941. I was trying to locate works by these artists, and I did have people, what you would call pickers, in the United States and in Paris, and I was able to locate some works, especially this work, this self-portrait by him from 1915. So I started doing this research and finding that some of these artists really were the artists who put the area on the map culturally. They were primarily women and Asian American artists. One surprise for me was the actor Key Luke, who many of you know as #1 son from the Charlie Chan movies. He actually was from Seattle and did not begin his career as an actor. He began his career as a painter and an illustrator. And you could see one of his illustrations very much in the manner of Aubrey Beardsley from the early 1920s. And he was very, very famous and then moved to Los Angeles and became an actor and one of the first Chinese-American actors to be successful in Hollywood. My biggest discovery was the Seattle Camera Club, which was all Issei except for 2 female Caucasian artists. This group of photographic artists were the first internationally known art group from Seattle. And their main medium obviously was photography. And during my studies of this group, I found that by 1927, 7 of the top 10 most exhibited pictorialist or artistic photographers in North America were members of the Seattle Camera Club, with Dr. Koike, that you can see him there on your right, being the #1 pictorialist in the entire world by 1930. So again, there's so much more to tell you about these photographers. When I was trying to do my research on them, some of the works, well, a lot of them were lost because of the incarceration, but I did find quite a few of them in libraries in Washington State, especially at the University of Washington's Special Collections at Suzzallo Library. But they weren't listed and they weren't collected as fine art. They were collected as by image and subject matter. So I would have to look through images of bridges and images of trains and images of streets, and none of them were cataloged as works of art. So that's one thing that I felt that I needed to do, was bring recognition to this group, because they really were the first international group of artists from Seattle. And many of the works were lost. I had to be very creative in locating some of the works. I took ads out in newspapers that were near Miné, and was able to, through want ads, locate quite a few of Frank Kunishige's work. I won't talk about it here, but I would like to mention, maybe perhaps during the talk, of the what happened with a lot of these artists after their incarceration. So I found next that this next generation, following the photographers and the painters, were what we call modernists, right? So there's Mr. Tokita, and this portrait of self-portrait is now in the collection of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, given by his son, and Takuichi Fuji, another painter. There were 3 Japanese Americans who made an impact in Seattle as part of what was called the Group of 12. And they were the modernists active in Seattle at the time. One funny thing that I would share with you is that if you look at the self-portrait by Mr. Tokita, when I first met the family, also in 1986, where I restored some of their works, I thought that there was this strange-looking little stain on in the sweater. I don't know, can you see it there, like right in between the zipper there? And I asked his son, what did you spill on this, or what happened to it? And he said, oh, that's not a stain. My father was a chain smoker, and all of his clothing had burn holes in it from cigarettes. So again, there was this wonderful thread that I found that covered almost 100 years of the 20th century, artists of Asian descent working with each other and working with Caucasian artists as well, but really offering support and mentorship to a lot of the artists. So again, I started meeting some of the artists who were still living. I met Andrew Chin, who's on your left, and Andy was born in Seattle, but like so many immigrants at the time, children of immigrants, he was educated in China. And Fei Chong, that self-portrait on your right, that's a lino-cut self-portrait done during the time of the WPA. And you can see both of their works were reflective of the region, you know, a downtown Seattle scene, or low-income housing scene by Fei Chong there on the right. And they used their training and their Chinese brush painting to mix with the Western style of painting and depicting local subject matter. And so it wasn't just photography and painting that a lot of these artists worked in. They were also involved with ceramics. And Henry Huan Lin was a very successful ceramic artist who began his career in Seattle and taught, was a student and then taught at the University of Washington. And I want you to know that if you go outside and do a tour of the mall, you'll see the Vietnam Memorial out there, outside, and that was done by Henry Lin's daughter, Maya Lin. Okay, so this is, some of you are going to recognize one of these artists. So I really love the interaction between a lot of the artists of color. And you see a woman here in your upper right. Now, most of you are already familiar with Yayoi Kusama, right? Right? You know who she is, the polka dot pumpkins and everything. Okay, so she actually she had her first American exhibition in Seattle with this woman that she's pictured with named Zoe Dusan. Zoe Dusan was a black woman. Her and her parents were the early members of the NAACP in Seattle, and she went back and forth to New York and then traveled to Europe. And she actually was the first commercial gallery in Seattle to show the work of artists such as Mondrian, Matisse, and some of the great European artists. But then she also took a liking to the Asian American artists there. And so you see George Tsutakawa's work. He was a painter, printmaker, and as well as a sculptor, and he became very famous for his design of fountains throughout the world. I recently did a book on George Tsutakawa, working with his son and daughter primarily, and I found, again, within the family, sometimes the families don't even really know the history of their family members, right? Their parents or grandparents. And I located several hundred works on paper that were up in their attic and in their basement that they had never seen before. So that is now a book, and the work is really amazing. That's George Tsutakawa on the bottom in the center, Paul Horiuchi on the left, and John Matsudaira on the right. So I'm going to close with talking about this friend of mine, John Matsudaira, and you can see his self-portrait in the upper right, but you can also see that it's on display here at the Smithsonian. His brother donated it several years ago. But I wanted to just tell you, John was an amazing guy. I met him through another artist many years ago, 20-some years ago, and he had opened up to me about his time at Miné. He was the eldest of 13 children, good Catholic family, and they were all incarcerated at Miné. Now, to prove that he was an American and that he held the country dear to him, he joined the Army while he was incarcerated and became a member of the 442nd Infantry Division. That is one of the most decorated platoons, I guess you would say, of the war of World War II. And unfortunately, John was injured severely in Leghorn, Italy during the war, and he had a severe shrapnel injury, and he told me that he didn't even know he was hurt until he started feeling warm fluid around his midsection, and that was blood, because it was freezing cold. And so John painted this a few years later, a self-portrait of himself in the foxhole. I hope you'll all get a chance to see it. And he was an amazing, amazing guy. He endured over 30 operations and spent over 3 years in the hospital from his injuries. And when he returned from hospital, he went to art school on the GI Bill, beginning around 1947 and 48. So John is somebody that I've been getting some, questions about from other museums as well as this museum, and we're trying to get some of his work out into the world. And I'll close with another photographer that I've studied and written about. Chao Chen Yang was a Chinese immigrant who moved to Chicago as Chinese consul, and then moved to Seattle in around 1939. He was one of the first color photographers in Washington State, and I had known his widow and his son for over 30 years, and I kept trying to get them to take these photographs out of their basement ping pong table, which is where they were stored, and get them out into the world. And finally, I irritated him enough where he finally gave me permission to get works out into museums, and there's quite a nice collection of his work here. In 2021, Historian Joan Key wrote a story about Chao Chen-yang for Art Forum magazine, and that initiated a lot more interest in his work. And also, thank you, Joan, if you're here, because it convinced my board that it was a good artist for me to write a book about and curate a show about. So that was very helpful to me. And finally, I'll end with his student, Josel Namkung, who was a Korean immigrant who moved to Seattle in 1947 as a classical musician, and he was the student and apprentice for Chao Chen-yang. And his work was always inspired by his classical music background, and that is my current exhibition at our museum in Edmonds, Washington. So as you can see, there was a thread that went from almost 100 years, and the artists giving support to each other and elevating each other throughout decades of work. So I hope you enjoyed it, meeting these artists, and thank you.
Thank you all for your presentations. And just a reminder to everybody in the audience to please submit any questions you have on cards. And if you need a card, raise your hand. I'll start. You've all been doing this work for years. And David, you had sort of referenced research before the internet. And I just wonder if you could expand a little bit more on that, on the real nitty-gritty of the methods that you used in those, especially before the internet.
Yeah, my research started with the Seattle Public Library and the library at the University of Washington. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. And the most horrific thing called microfiche. I would get like horrible headaches from watching that screen. But I also found, to be really upfront about this, I found a lack of interest in most of the institutions. So like for instance, with the Seattle Camera Club, when I first started studying them, luckily there were people still alive that knew these artists that I was able to, they were elderly, but they were able to give me information. But the Seattle Public Library keeps records of early artists in their collection, and they have a scrapbook of photographers, and they have a scrapbook of painters and printmakers, et cetera. And when I started my research, all of the Japanese photographers were ripped out and destroyed, ripped out of the scrapbooks. So it was very difficult to research these, and I'm grateful that I started when I did, because there were plenty of people around that were still alive that could help me out with it. So.
Do either of you want to add on to that?
I was going to make a joke about your question, but I won't. I was going to say that we send out pigeons before the internet to communicate. I actually want to take the opportunity to give a shout out to all the librarians, archivists, and registrars. You will find that they are the most dedicated people who basically protect all the materials, organize them, sometimes against the institution's wish. Resisting, for example, the request of burning certain films or negatives. And so those people need to be recognized when we're on stage, but they are really the heroes. The other thing I would say is that even with the help of the internet, seeing the works, especially historical works, in person is so valuable and so important, because often we'll find that the physical work tells us something about the history of the work, the labels on the back, and also artists' own handwriting on the frames and in the verso of the canvas. And that's usually on the internet. You don't get that information. And so, again, that kind of research is costly because you physically need to visit. And I think even with the internet, and you see a lot more, you get to spend a lot of time. I know people scrolling through eBay at 2 o'clock in the morning looking for artworks. That, even when you get it, you still need to be able to see the real works.
Patricia, are there special challenges with tracking down works of art or confirming biographical material, especially in the case of Japanese American artists who were displaced and, as you mentioned, lost belongings during the war?
I think the biggest issue that we probably all are running into, because we're all three researching artists that, from 1920 forward to maybe 1970 or 1980, is that many of these people have passed on. So you're relying on the families to provide the fact-checking for you. When I started doing my first project, which was Only What We Could Carry, which was very literary, the other thing that I came across was books out of print. So you might find something by somebody who's written or something that was published, like a catalog, but it's really hard to find it. Like maybe you're lucky and you'll find it in some obscure ethnic studies library in the basement, and it's tucked in between all these other things, and you never know maybe even who published it. But I'd say that the biggest thing right now for me is writing something and not being able to fact check it against somebody who's going to really know the nitty-gritty information. But again, aside from what ShiPu's saying about having to go on location and dig, but sometimes it's the archives and sometimes it's still with the families. I still end up going to families and going into their closets and under the beds and over weird places like the ping pong table was a great one.
ShiPu, you mentioned a number of artist families that you've worked with and done the crawling under the bed and into the attic and so on. And could you expand on some of the issues or challenges that these artist families face in stewarding a body of work and a legacy of an artist, and what kind of advice do you give them?
I'll talk about the challenges first, and this is pretty general, and I won't give you specific examples because I'm protecting private information as well. But in general, the space is really the biggest issue. Imagine whatever space your home is, having to have stacks of paintings, especially frame paintings, protected and preserved is a big burden. I mean, it's a great privilege, but it's also a big burden. And so that's number one. Number two is often the families are not in the art world or art business. And so there's not really a system for them to be able to sort things in an organized way so that whoever wants to come in and look, they can show you. They have full-time jobs. They are not going to be just sitting at home waiting for you to visit. And so that is really layers of challenges. In terms of the advice I often give family, and I just had a chat with another family recently, is I reduce it down to one thing, which is you have to figure out a way to be honest with what you want to accomplish. That saves everybody a lot of time. I've encountered families where they get the sense that they want the artwork to be in museums, but underneath that, they really wanted to also get monetary compensation for it. But they don't feel comfortable because they've never been in that position to be able to say, well, we have this artwork and we require or demand or expect this kind of acquisition amount. And so that's always a struggle. And it's much easier if the family can be honest about what they want and also with being honest with each other, because I mentioned family dynamics, and every family is different. Sometimes you see they are making decisions that are contradictory to each other, and museum curators do find that challenging when you want to make an honest effort to acquire the artwork. And as an outsider, you can't really step into that kind of family dynamic. So it's really tricky, and which is why I think that it's important to invest in the time to build that relationship, because it's not a, I put it crassly, grab and go situation. But you want to be able to get to know them and actually understand what they want, and that takes time. We don't sometimes know what we want. And so that takes time, and once you build up a relationship, then you can decide how do we best help you in that sense.
Can I jump in on that really quickly? ShiPu, when I worked at the Japanese American National Museum, I was kind of unfortunately in charge of people bringing stuff to the museum. So I would get phone calls saying, someone's down in the lobby, Patricia, please come downstairs. They've got at least 5 boxes. And so it was like, you don't know what's going to show up. And I would be honest with people too. So it's going back to slowing them down, because really most of them just wanted to like dump and go. Like they wanted to do a drive-by drop-off. And what we really encouraged these families to do was to think about what's in here. Do you have stories to share me what this is? Because I got this sense over seeing this many times over and over again that people did not know what their purpose and their goal was in getting out of their hands. And sometimes I really was sensing that they felt guilty about the stuff, and they think that the museum is the best place for it. And I almost always convince them that this belongs with you. You will love it like no other museum will. You will know the story, you will know the person. And if you don't know the people in the photos, maybe those are less valuable, right? You kind of are the most direct lineage to these items, to these photos, to these letters. And I always ask them the question too, like, what in your house do you have that there's only one of them in the world, right? Like you've got all these cups or things that you've got that are mass produced, but this letter, there's only one. There's only one of these photographs left, right? So, and then they would kind of get ashamed and leave.
I was just going to say that it's been my experience too with getting to know the families over years, and with Chao Chen Yang, who I spoke about towards the end of my talk. I had known his wife and his son for many, many years, and the son, even after his mother passed away, he kept putting me off, and I said, these photographs are going to get damaged and you need to do something with it. And you know what the actual problem was with him is that he thought nobody would know who his father was and that no one would care. And so when we had some works donated here and to other museums, he was absolutely shocked that people were interested in his father's work. And he was a very well-educated man. He's an architect, and that was one of the problems. He just didn't think his father was worthy of being in a museum.
I would just add that on the other side is also having the realistic expectation of once your artworks or objects are in the museum, what is the extent of the display? I've talked to a lot of families who expect that once the painting is in, it's going to be on the wall. When I walk into the museum, I'm going to be able to see it, right? And that's natural to expect that, but that's not realistic. And some families do have the experience of somehow donating or giving the artworks to museums and never get to see them. They're just in storage. Even when you want to go see their work, family members cannot see them, right? So you could understand the trepidation or sort of the experience of that scare, but at the same time, you also can't expect them to just be able to see them all the time on the walls.
So one of the questions from an audience member that seems related to your exchange, in interacting with and collecting from Asian American families, what have you found to be considered ethical work? What might collectors/archivists need to consider when coming into these homes of multi-generational and descendant families? And that could be directed toward any of you. I mean, from everything you've described, there's a whole landscape of ethical and practical considerations that you're navigating and working with the families of artists.
No, I don't mean to be speaking so much against my nature. I think for me, so I guess I can speak from my experiences that because I'm a scholar and I also curate, I'm not an art dealer. So I can help the family as well as the museum because I don't have any financial gains in that. And I also don't take commission or any finder's fees. And that's a unique position that I can sort of help both sides. But not everybody operates in the same way. I think the ethical position is that are you helping certain people from either side or multiple sides to take advantage of maybe a trend or a sort of push for certain acquisitions and you buy the artworks and that's it? Or are you really thinking about long-term what's the best way for preserving the legacy of the artist? And that's a difficult question because I do know, and I won't give names, but I do know a family that owned Hayakawa's artworks. Her artworks are not very easy to find. If you go on eBay, you will probably encounter her work at some point. But that family wanted to sell them because they needed the money. And that's a real consideration. You can't disrespect that at all, right? Because they have these artworks, and the exhibition is now touring. They think this is going to help what they can get. And that's, I think, totally reasonable for the family to make that decision. And it's really not our position to make that decision for them. At least that's my position. Yeah.
My experience is actually different for each family, to be honest with you. Many of the families didn't want to take money from their relative because they thought it was not right that they should make money off of them. But then I also, I never did anything for sales or of any of this work, but I also facilitated for one artist. The museum wanted them to donate a collection of Mr. Nomura's work, it was. And they were torn because they really didn't have much money. And they didn't want to sell it, but they also needed money. So what I did was I facilitated with the museum part purchase and part donation. And it really helped them out financially quite a bit. And then they felt secure and safe that the work was being cared for.
Here's a much broader question. I'm curious what you will say. What does success look like in the pursuit of rediscovering Asian American art?
That's a fun question.
Patricia?
That's a fun question. I mean, again, I'm a little different because I haven't done this, these two have done in terms of moving someone's family's archives or an artist's archives into a museum. I've worked mostly from the publishing end, and so I want to remind people that we always ensure that the copyright is staying with the family, and it's usually a joint thing where we're really trying to just publish by making public the work. But to me, the success is honestly acceptance, like warm acceptance by that family and by the community and an embrace of the work. Like what we came up with in the end is just hits the right tone is one important thing, because I work with language so much, and that the work is just, there's enough of it. It looks good, the colors are right. I mean, these are things that you could do wrong, I suppose. And for a lot of these families, I think it's maybe their last chance to see something in a monograph or a catalog, and you want to do that legacy right. And that, again, once you have a book, you can hand it out to many people. And I think they find a lot of pleasure in that, which I find very gratifying and like a success.
Well, I guess seeing the work accepted in displayed in different museums, seeing it here is really very emotional for me because some of these artists were friends of mine. And I've been very lucky to be able to write books on some of these artists and contribute to other publications that include their work. So really for me, it's the satisfaction of, I'm just gonna say it really bluntly, I was laughed at in the beginning of my career for focusing on these artists. And it gives me a great deal of pleasure because I always knew that the art was really good. And, and now some of the same people that made fun of my research are trying to jump on the bandwagon. So, so that feels good.
I would just say that I don't think of it as success, but sort of more of a goal that if we could get these artists or their artworks be part of the conversation, right? It's about representation, but also be part of the conversation and enrich that kind of historical accounts so that not necessarily filling the gaps, but also having a more broader view of what actually happened, right? For Japanese American communities, the discussion should be about World War II experience, but it shouldn't erase the pre-war and post-war period. And that's always my drive, is that if I could expand that discussion, to me, that's the goal I'm trying to achieve.
So here's a question that is specific to Japanese American artists, and I'm going to paraphrase a little bit because, forgive me, whoever submitted this question, there are a few words I can't quite make out, but I think I can get to the point. And the question is about, for Japanese American artists who were incarcerated during the war, did they have thoughts on how that experience hindered or maybe helped their art those years? How did it affect their artistic development? And I have a feeling there's a different answer across different artists' experiences, but.
I think, Patricia, you talked to quite a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a case-by-case situation, because I think about someone like, people that are different ages, for one, would infect that. So if you're an older Issei artist and you are just have already been pushing for a long time, and then you get put into these prison camps, I can imagine that by and large, their spirit is sort of sucked out of them, and they're also still having to pull together their family. But if you were younger and you didn't have a big family, like Miné Okubo didn't have to have that same kind of responsibility, and she was producing work in camp that was getting exhibited back in San Francisco. Am I right on this? And it actually created an opportunity that would not, she wouldn't have wished upon it, but I think it changed the trajectory of her work and actually the style also too. But I think about other artists and writers who were put into this incarceration experience, and surely they were just crushed by it. And at the same time, there are wonderful examples of artists and writers who use this as a way to focus as well. Like, I have free time now that I didn't have when I had a full-time job. I have a story to tell. I have a job. And so I do think that there are some examples where the work just got a finer point to it because of the focus, because of the topics. And I mean, there are some weird examples, or not weird, but there are some unusual examples, like someone like the painter Hideo Date, who didn't necessarily paint the objects around him or the scenery around him. He didn't paint barracks or the mess halls the way that a lot of other artists had done. He started to actually draw and paint cats. I know that this seems very strange, but when you really study what he was producing in camp, it also is kind of a embodiment of the emotions that he's going with and the torment, I imagine. So anyway.
Here's sort of a specific question. I'm not sure, I'm hoping one of you might have an answer. Is there a site where there is a listing, or is there an encyclopedia of some kind of Asian American artists? A catalog raisonné, a website? Also, same question about Northwest artists.
Well, there's Densho, which is very good. It's a cultural, it's not just related to art. I can speak for the Pacific Northwest. I've written, I think, 15 books, and with the University of Washington, a couple of them are co-authored. But You know, I wanted, if you don't mind me saying something that pertaining to the last question, I didn't bring this up in the talk because I didn't want to drag everyone down, but the incarceration of, when I first learned about it in 1986, I was calling them concentration camps. And people kept correcting me that these were not in concentration camps, that no one was killed, and that I shouldn't be using that term. But let me just tell you a few of the fates of some of these artists. Kenjiro Nomura, who I showed you, started my talk with, when he was released from the camp, his wife committed suicide. When Mr. Kunishige, one of the greatest photographers in the world, when he was released, he moved in with the family, the Nomura family, and just became so depressed that he couldn't even walk anymore, and they had to take care of him. Dr. Koike had a heart attack 2 years later after being released, and so there was a lot of damage done to these artists, and just because they weren't killed in the camp, it doesn't mean that they weren't devastated in their life. So.
Wait, but let's talk about the encyclopedia, because I
right.
just wanted to shout out, I can't get the title completely right, but Mark Dean Johnson and
Yes. Gordon Chang.
Gordon Chang, thank you, co-authored or co-oversaw a massive project several years ago that I call the Asian American Dictionary, encyclopedia, and it's in published form, and it's called Asian American Art History. Art history? Yes.
1850 to 1970. We have the lead editor in the audience.
This is the book to get, people.
And the reason why I don't have the correct title on the tip of my tongue, Mark, is because I also just call it the Asian American,
Right.
that's it. It's the book. It's the Asian American Art History book. So,
Thank you. Thank you, Mark.
yeah, thank you, Mark. There's so many interesting questions. Let me ask this one. Do you find there's personal healing in doing your kind of work?
I'll go, I guess. I wouldn't call it personal healing. That's very lofty. But it's gratifying to see the works go into a home and knowing that whatever the condition was before, it's going to be in the museum. Even if it's not on the wall, museums are committed to taking care of the artworks. I mean, some of you probably know this, and some of you are from this field, that acquisitions don't get sold off or removed from the permanent collection, at least not easily or often. And so it's really a security of knowing that that work is going to be safe and be in the museum. And that, to me, is gratifying, worth all the months and months of talking to different people and connecting them. That's why we do what I do, I guess. Yeah, I think for both of you, too.
Yeah, I would say that because books also take many years for them to go from the concept to the actual, sometimes writing of all the stuff and then photographing or scanning the artwork and the design and all these things, that at the end of it, at least in the ideal case, you've become friends with this whole team and the family, and it is healing to see them watch this process. And I mean, I just love books too. So at the end, you've got this thing, but really what you had again was the process and the journey. And as a yonsei, again, like my sister and brother think I'm crazy. They're like, what are you doing? Like, it's not that usual for a yonsei to be super involved with the oral histories and asking the same questions, but to different people and circumstances. And I do find that something I think our community needs, and I would like to be the one to help. So, sure.
I actually wanted to ask you about your oral history practice. Patricia, can you expand on that a little bit? How do you prepare for them, make them successful, and what is revealed in a good oral history interview that's really special and different from
Sure.
archival research?
Well, mainly these days I've been doing oral histories for Densho. So they have a pretty extensive oral history component of their website where everything is videotaped and then transcribed. So it's very convenient for people to be able to just even search the transcription. And sometimes it started out with them inviting me to come when they would come to the Bay Area, and they would do this interesting thing where they would book out 4 rooms in a hotel in Emeryville, and they would basically book in all these different people with oral historians like ready to go. So we were like, go into the room, go into your pod. And we would all do our interviews, and they're usually about 2.5 to 3 hours long, and then we would come out and we get the next person. But after a while, they did tell me that there was more demand. We also first started with just focusing on Nisei generation, second generation Japanese American, and as those people have really passed on, they actually just said, if you can find a good videographer, you can start suggesting names of people. So 2 things that they also really enforce with their work is, one, that you always have to do a pre-interview, which means I need to do research ahead of time. I do think that this is an important part of a really good oral history, is you have to know the questions to ask. So even if you do end up asking the same questions about where you were born, or who were your parents, what were your parents' names, and so forth, because that's part of the history. Doing the research can be really, really time consuming, because especially if the person, I'm just going to give an example. This person was an artist, but they were also community leader, and they were the founder of an institution. So there's a lot of having to do the work into doing as much reading as you can. And sometimes I will do a pre-interview. So I will call them on the phone, and we will do a 2-hour interview ahead of time. And that way it actually, one, warms them up. So they know that I'm kind of going to be asking questions about this. They can either look it up, because sometimes they'll just be like, I have no idea, right? And they'll need to go and do research themselves. Or it also just jumpstarts something else. So they're not surprised when we return to it. And I can actually tell them, like, okay, this led down a really interesting path. Can we focus on that next time? Because we also start getting a sense of length. So I'd say those are the things that are most important. For Densho, we also always send them a transcription, and they are allowed to strike anything from that record that they feel uncomfortable with, but we usually can't take it out of the video, because it's really hard to go through and redact stuff out of the video. But most of the time it's really minor things that they don't like. Like, oh, I got that date wrong, and I want to fix it in the transcription. So, but I love to do the oral history work, because it's a long talk, but it's also on record. It's not as long as going back 4 times and talking to Ibuki and asking questions, or Satoru and asking questions, but it's also a capsule that we know is going to be prepared for the public, right? So
We're basically at the end of our time, but I'm just going to ask one quick question. Well, I hope it's a quick question that each of you could answer, and then we'll call it a night. What motivates you to keep doing this work? Is there a particular hope that you have for the rest of your career in this field?
I already answered that, so you get to take it over.
that's not fair. I thought you were going to say the money.
I wish.
Yeah, you wish. I think the beauty of the work. I mean, just seeing really incredible paintings and photography, or in my case, writing, that's really hasn't seen the light of day in decades, is such a beautiful thing. It's a lucky thing to be in that circle of that, in an intimate setting with the families often. That's what keeps me going, so.
Vengeance. Listen, I'm sorry, I'm Italian. I can't, what can I say? That is part of it, I'm sorry to say. But going back to what we talked about earlier, the greatest thing for me is, we might look over and see, oh, that's a Henry Moore. Oh, that's a Monet. But you don't see the people. I mean, there's a person that created that. And to me, it's so important to know the story of the person creating the work of art that you're enjoying. And And so just to have the special relationships with some of the artists themselves or their families, and when I have a show and they're crying, and it's so meaningful to them, that is all the reward I need.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight, and thank you, all of you, for your work.